So let's look at a famous studio. This is Air Studios in London. This is a studio that had made tons of major recordings. Okay, so you've got a booth over here, you've got a booth over here, you've got a control room in the center, and a big live room here. Right? So you could set up literally 60 pieces of orchestration here, have a piano in this side, and have a drummer in this side. All isolated, totally isolated. So that when you record them, the mix engineer can actually mix without the problem of sound bleed between them. It's a very actually well-known studio. Another studio, this is Studio One Air Studios, control room, and then on this side here is the live room, and you've got moving wall positions so that you can actually adjust the acoustics of the room. And here's another one. O. Henry Studios, this is in Burbank, actually, if they're still around anymore. Isolation 1, 2, and 3, large room. This is 50 by 32 by 22 tall. So it's a pretty large room. And they do a lot of orchestration in this room. A lot of films where they have full orchestras. Sound console right here, and then you've got the workstation where somebody's playing keyboards back here. You've got isolations. You've got a lounge usually attached with the soda machine and the couch. You've got Woodman Studios, much smaller studio, but this is on Woodman in Studio City. And you've got a control room with the speakers, and you've got typically you've got a couch behind the console over here to sound absorb. And then you got the speakers, and you've got the isolation. This is a side view kind of a studio instead of a front view. Turn your head to watch what's going on with the musicians. The front view usually has a wall here that's really heavy, so it's holding speakers and soffits for major big sound speakers. So sometimes it's an easier construction to put a side view in. Robert Lang Recording Studios. Back in the 80s, needless to say, when record companies were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on making a record, and the equipment in the studio was so expensive that you could justify those kind of costs, we would put all these amenities for the artists. You know, you'd have the lounge with the champagne, and then you'd have the fruit tray that cost like $80 a day, and then you know, all of this stuff. I remember one of the studios I worked in actually had a jacuzzi in one of the lounges. Get a lot of work done that way, right? One of the studios I worked in had an actual slot car track that was bigger than this room, and the band would go in there and play slot cars and video machines and all sorts of stuff. This is in the 80s when everybody had too much time on their hands and too much money. Anyway, so roles in the recording studio: there's a producer, engineer, editor, assistant engineer, maintenance engineer. All of these roles have really changed through the years, and I bet you if I asked 3 people in this room what's the role of a producer, you'd all have different ideas of what they do. Typically, the role of a producer in the classical sense, let's start in the 40s and 50s, a record producer's job was to answer to the record label, provide them with a product that came from the musicians that was commercially acceptable to be exploited and made money on. So they had to answer to the record label, and the band or the musicians, they basically were in charge of making sure the studio was hired, the session musicians were there, that the artist would get to the studio on time. He would be sometimes charged with picking songs from music publishers for the artist to sing. His role basically was like the general contractor. He wasn't a creative soul at all. He wasn't really very creative in the whole process other than picking songs and sometimes saying, hey, I really like that or I don't like that. But generally speaking, it was the musician and the artist that made determinations over the creative decisions. That's different than how people think of a producer today, right? So he's the general contractor, and most people want to be called producer because everyone thinks they're the boss, right? Boss of everything, right? So the producer in music is basically the guy who makes sure that everything comes in on budget and that the record company has something they can sell and the artist is satisfied. So it's really sort of like You have to juggle everybody's emotions, everybody's feelings about the product, and be sort of the guy that calms down the artist when they get upset about what they're doing and they don't like what they're doing, and the label saying, we can't sell this, and then you have to convince them that they can. So you're basically the guy that no matter what, it's your fault if it doesn't sell. And then, of course, if it does sell, the artist thinks it's because they're so great, right? So it's a very thankless job in many ways. Today, everybody thinks of a record producer as a guy that's sitting behind the computer programming everything. But even back in the 80s and the 90s, the guy that did that was called a programmer. He wasn't the producer. Now the engineer, producer, programmer have sort of merged into one unit. So if you're a record producer, even songwriter is part of that. So you're writing a song, you're programming it, you're producing it, deciding where musical parts go, you're being the musician. You're also in charge of your budget because it's your time, and you're paying for studio time sometimes. So a lot of these roles have sort of been blended together in many ways. And for the people that are in the music industry part, business part, this is extremely important to understand, is that everybody has a different understanding of what these roles are and how much each role is supposed to do and how much they're supposed to get paid for each role, right? So that's why it's really important to understand how these roles shift and change based upon what kind of artist you're working with, how the record's going to be produced, what's needed in producing the record, if it's on a major label, a minor label, or an indie label, or your own label. So all of these things matter a lot. If you're in the music business part, you have to be aware of what each role consists of and economically what they get paid and what their responsibilities are. I know many times as an engineer, I basically did all the music production too, because the producer was at the beach. So he's calling me up going, how's it sound? I'm going, great. He goes, play it and put the phone up to the speaker. So I do this kind of thing. He'd go, great, I'll see you tomorrow. Keep going. And in reality, he was doing his job, right? He was doing his job because he hired me. He's supposed to hire the people to get the job done. He knew that I'd do everything for him, so he'd just go to the beach and make sure that I did my job. So he got all the credit, and he got all the hate mail when it didn't sell, too. So, you know, I had no responsibility to the label. I just got paid. So, see what I'm saying? So the roles really change a lot. And if I got testy with him and said, hey, I really need a point on this record because I made the record and you were at the beach the whole time, he probably wouldn't call me up for the next record. But he was getting the work from the label because he was the genius that created the hit. Right? So he's the guy that called the right musician to play drums. He's the guy that orchestrated the whole making of the record and was responsible for the economics. So if he wanted to spend his time at the beach and make sure that everybody did their job after he hired them all, he's a very non-hands-on producer. So that's production. Engineer is the guy that basically, typically in the classical sense, was the guy that was actually an electrical engineer. They needed an actual engineer, electrical engineer around to make sure the equipment ran, to make sure that the tape ran on speed, to make sure that, well, gee, we need an effect. How are we going to do it? I don't know. Let me go to my lab and build something for you. And that's what I used to do back in the day. One of the studios I worked at, they needed a microphone preamp. I said, okay, I'll build one. Talk to me in a couple days. And I'd build one and bring it into the studio, and they'd use it. So a lot of the gear were actually pieces of gear that engineers in the studio created because they had a need for it. Recording arts was really for a select few. And now it's become for everyone. And I think it's great that everybody can participate in music making and being creative. So that's the role of the engineer. Today, the role of the engineer also overlaps with producer and programmer and musician, and everything's kind of getting all confused. Editor, engineer does a lot of editing of sound, but there's actually sound editors that work in film that actually do the editing and make sure that the timing's correct against picture and all that kind of stuff. Assistant engineers, in my day, in the early days, was a guy that just went and got coffee. And then studios also had a runner. The runner was the guy that had to go run for things. So if you had a really obnoxious band. You know, one guy wanted Taco Bell, another guy wanted McDonald's, another guy, you know, and then he'd have to run all over town and come back. We used to do stuff to those guys. They were part of our team, so we'd play with them a little bit. But, you know, there were times we'd say, get any fruit that's out of season. They'd come back, no, that's not good. I don't like that. I'm allergic to that. Get another piece of fruit. So then they go running around again. And at the end of the day, you know, they got a good credit on the record, and they were happy. Maintenance engineers, they were really critical in studios. Back in the day, you know, if you were just an engineer or a second engineer or wanted to be an assistant engineer or be a runner, you couldn't really get into the studio because it was so private. You know, you couldn't walk into the control room if you weren't like the first engineer or the producer. You couldn't get in there and see how they made the sounds, how they recorded it, where they placed microphones, all those kinds of things. It was very hard to work your way into that. And so many people would just do whatever they could, just be around it, until somebody got sick and they were called in, you know, to save the day and move a microphone 10 feet. But as a maintenance engineer, you were extremely critical to the operations of the studio, because if the equipment didn't work, they weren't recording, they weren't making money. So as an electrical engineer myself, I used that angle to get into any studio I wanted. And I went to New York. I'm from Chicago. I went from Chicago to New York and worked at the major studios around the time they were making Born in the USA with Bruce Springsteen. And I just walked into the studio and I said, I'm a maintenance engineer. I can fix that tape machine for you. And they'd say, you're in. So that gave me an interesting perspective on the whole recording industry when I'd see my peers just struggling to run around and get coffee for people and try to get into the control room. Maintenance engineers used to be extremely important, and in today's major studios, the IT engineer is the same role, right? So the computer blows up, what are we going to do? He comes in and saves the day, right? So they're still very valuable in recording studios. In your home project studio, unfortunately, you guys have to be the maintenance engineer, which means that you go on YouTube and find out how to fix it, or you Google, what does this error mean? Roles in the film industry, the music supervisor is a guy that picks out music that will be put behind certain scenes. He also has to go license it from the owners of the master and the publisher who owns the song. The editor edits it in. The recordist is involved. Mix engineer in a film, they have to take all of these sound elements, mix it all together, make it look and sound realistic against picture on a major stage. And the mix stages are actual theaters with a big mixing console in the back, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of tracks with multiple Pro Tools systems playing different elements, sound elements that were created at different studios, voiceover, music, and the like. And they're in charge of putting it all together. And the producer and director sit in the theater and watch it and say, well, I don't know. The music's too loud. I can't hear dialogue. You know, they make all of those kinds of adjustments before the film's done. So that was my sort of introduction right there to the recording arts.